The Maw Nebula swallowed the fleet like a throat swallowing a scream. The moment they crossed the boundary, everything changed. The stars vanished behind walls of black and purple gas, so thick that light could not pass through them. Sensors degraded to a fraction of their range, and the ships flew half-blind through a darkness that pressed against the hulls like something alive. Every crew member on every vessel felt it, a wrongness in the air, a weight on the chest, as if the nebula itself knew what lived inside it and was warning them to turn back. Vasquez stood on the bridge of the Unbroken and watched the sensor display flicker and stutter. She had led fleets into asteroid fields and through the burning debris of space stations, and once through the atmosphere of a gas giant during a lightning storm, but she had never felt anything like this. The Maw was not just dark, it was hostile. "Contact," the sensor officer called out. "Multiple contacts, bearing 035, thousands of them." The hunger had been waiting. They came from every direction, erupting out of the gas clouds like predators launching from cover. Swarm tendrils the size of moons, each one a writhing mass of interconnected organisms moving as a single limb of the greater intelligence. Living minefield organisms drifted in the fleet's path, invisible until ships were almost on top of them, detonating in bursts of acid and biological shrapnel. And then came the worst of it, the psychic disruption waves. No one had warned them about the psychic disruption waves, because no one had ever survived long enough to report them. The core nexus was broadcasting on frequencies that human brains were never meant to receive, and the effect was devastating. On ships across the fleet, crew members screamed and collapsed, clawing at their heads. Navigators lost orientation. Gunners saw targets that were not there. Pilots flew into each other. 47 ships were lost in the first. The destroyer Relentless flew into a minefield and broke in half. The cruiser Adamant was swarmed by tendrils and torn apart deck by deck, its crew fighting hand-to-hand in the corridors with cutting tools and sidearms until the reactor went critical. The carrier Solace took a direct hit from an acid barrage that melted through its flight deck and killed 300 pilots before they could launch. It was a nightmare. It was exactly what Vasquez had told her admirals it would be. And it did not matter, because humanity did not stop. On the cruiser Defiant, a damage control team sealed a hull breach with their own bodies, holding emergency patches in place with their hands, while the vacuum pulled at their skin until the welders could get through. On the frigate Ironclad, the captain rammed his ship into a swarm tendril that was about to envelop a troop transport, killing himself and his crew to save 4,000 Marines. Carrier Tempest. 12 pilots flew directly into the Hunger's minefield to clear a path, detonating the living mines with their own ships so that the fleet behind them could pass. Vasquez received casualty reports every 10 minutes, and each one was worse than the last. 73 ships lost, 8,000 dead, 12,000, 20,000. She did not flinch. She could not afford to flinch, because the moment she showed doubt, the moment she hesitated, the fleet would feel it, and the fleet would break, and everything they had sacrificed would mean nothing. "Push forward," she said, every time. "All units, push forward." The fleet drove deeper into the Maw, fighting for every kilometer, and slowly, painfully, the gas began to thin ahead of them. The sensor officer shouted a reading that made everyone on the bridge stop breathing. "Contact dead ahead. Range 200,000 kilometers. It is massive." The core nexus of the Hunger appeared on the display, like a bat, tumor in the heart of the nebula. It was the size of a small planet, a grotesque sphere of living tissue that pulsed with bioluminescent light in colors that human eyes could not properly process. Veins the width of rivers ran across its surface, carrying fluid that glowed with the stolen genetic material of 1,000 dead civilizations. It was the most terrible and the most beautiful thing any of them had ever seen. 1,000,000 years of consumed life, stored and catalogued and kept like trophies in a gallery of extinction. The hunger knew the fleet was close, and it threw its last defenses at them with the desperate fury of a cornered animal. The psychic waves intensified until crew members were vomiting blood. The swarm tendrils wrapped around ships and crushed them. The acid rained down in torrents. Admiral Koss's flagship, the TNS Sovereign, took a critical hit and began to list to port, its engines failing. Koss transferred his flag to a destroyer and kept fighting, lost her entire forward destroyer screen, and filled the gap with her own cruiser. Standing in the path of the swarm, with nothing between her and death but hull plating and fury. And still the fleet pushed forward. Vasquez gave the final order when the range closed to 50,000 kilometers. "All dreadnoughts," she said, and her voice was the steadiest thing in the universe. "Main batteries, target the core nexus, fire." 6 dreadnoughts, the largest and most powerful warships humanity had ever built, aligned their main guns on the core nexus. Each gun was a magnetic accelerator cannon 2 kilometers long, designed to crack planets. Designed for a war between humans that had never happened, and now never needed to. The first volley struck the core nexus and tore open its skin, ripping a wound across its surface that vented atmosphere and fluid and light into the void. The hunger screamed, not in sound but in signal, a psychic shriek that every living thing in 3-star systems felt in their bones. The second volley went deeper, punching through the outer layers and into the internal structure where the stolen genetics were stored, where the memories of 1,000 dead worlds were kept, and it burned them. The information, the cultures and languages and histories and hopes of 400 civilizations that the hunger had consumed and kept as data. All of it was destroyed in a flash of nuclear fire. The third volley hit the center, the true brain of the organism, the nexus of the nexus, and it collapsed. The sphere crumbled inward like a dying star, folding in on itself, and the light went out of it all at once. Across the galaxy, the hunger died. Every tendril in the maw went limp and drifted. Every swarm ship in orbit around Vera 4 convulsed and broke apart. Every parasite on every world the hunger had touched curled up and stopped moving. It happened all at once, a wave of death spreading at the speed of thought, because the hunger was one mind, and when the mind died, everything connected to it died with it. On 100 worlds scattered across the stars, species that had lived in terror for centuries looked up and saw the hunger's remains burning in their atmospheres, falling like rain, like embers, like the ashes of a nightmare finally ending. Creatures that had hidden underground for generations stepped into sunlight they had forgotten existed, and watched the sky burn with the death of the thing that had haunted them. On Vera 4, Sethi Ka stood at the entrance of her bunker, and felt the ground stop shaking for the first time in 300 years. She spread her pale wings, the ones that were too old to fly, and she let the light of the twin suns fall on them, and she stood there in silence, because there were no words in her language for what she felt. The Fyari broadcast a message across every relay network in the galaxy. It was short, and it was simple, and it reached every species that was listening. They came, they fought, the hunger is gone. In the Maw Nebula, the human fleet drifted among the wreckage of the core nexus and counted its dead. 73 ships destroyed, over 40,000 men and women killed. The cost was enormous, and Vasquez felt every single death like a stone on her chest. She stood on the bridge of the Unbroken and looked out at the nebula, now lit by the burning remains of a thing that had terrorized the galaxy for 1,000,000 years. Her officers were cheering around her, and she let them because they had earned it. But she did not cheer. She was thinking about the dead, hers and everyone else's, the crews of all those alien ships in the graveyard around Vera, all those brave, foolish people who had answered the same call and paid for it with everything. Reeves came to stand beside her. "Is it over?" Vasquez nodded. "It is over." The communications console began to light up. Messages were pouring in from across the galaxy, from species that humanity had never met, from worlds that humanity had never visited. Words of thanks and wonder, and something that went beyond gratitude. Something that was closer to awe. One message came from the HFY historian, who had been tasked with recording the events for the permanent archive of the species. It was addressed to no one and everyone, and it was the last entry in a record that had begun 300 years ago with a cry for help. We sent our cry into the void expecting silence. We had accepted our end. We had made peace with our extinction. We thought we were alone. Instead, the humans came. They came not because they knew us. They came not because we could offer them anything. They came not because they owed us a debt, or sought our resources, or wanted our gratitude. They came because that is what they are. They hear the helpless, and they bring the storm. And the galaxy will never forget. Vasquez read it and said nothing. Turned back to the viewport and looked at the stars, the ones she could see now that the maw was clearing. And she thought about home. And she thought about the long journey back. And she thought about the fact that the universe was bigger and stranger and more terrible and more wonderful than she had ever imagined. Then she straightened her shoulders and turned to her crew. "Set a course for Vera 4, she said. "Our people need medical attention, and the HFY need help rebuilding." The Unbroken turned, and the fleet followed, and 600 warships, battered and scarred, and carrying the weight of 40,000 empty bunks, flew out of the darkness and into the light of the twin suns. Behind them, the Maw Nebula faded into nothing, just gas and dust, and the memory of a monster that would never hunt again. And ahead of them, the galaxy waited, no longer afraid. The question hung in the silence of the bridge, like smoke after a fire. "What are you?" Vasquez read it on the display and said nothing. Her officers watched her and waited. The communications team had confirmed it 3 times. The hunger, this ancient thing that had wandered the stars, eating civilizations the way a fire eats forests, had spoken for the first time in its existence. Not to threaten, not to demand, to ask. It was afraid. Lieutenant Commander Desch, the fleet's xenolinguistics officer, was the first to speak. "Admiral, this is unprecedented. The entity's communication is structured around a concept of genuine confusion. It has no frame of reference for what just happened to it. We are outside its experience entirely." Vasquez turned from the display and looked at him. She did not look like a woman who had just won the greatest military victory in human history. She looked tired and angry and cold. "I am not interested in talking to it," she said. Blinked, "Admiral, this could be the most important moment of first contact in it has eaten hundreds of civilizations," Vasquez said. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the bridge like a blade. "It has consumed entire worlds, entire species, wiped out cultures and histories and futures that we will never know. It is not a diplomat. It is not a misunderstood creature. It is a predator, and I do not negotiate with predators." She turned back to the display. "Mark the signal origin and track all retreating elements. I want to know where they are going." The remnants of the hunger fled into deep space, and the fleet's long-range sensors followed them like a hunter tracking blood on the snow. Vasquez let them run. She had no intention of chasing them blindly into the void. Not yet. First she needed information. The information came from the HFY. 3 days after the battle, a shuttle descended from the Unbroken to the surface of Vera 4 and landed on a patch of bare rock. That had once been a meadow. Vasquez stepped out with a security detail and a translation team, and she looked around at a world that had been half consumed. The horizon was divided perfectly in 2. On one side stood forests and rivers, and the organic architecture of the Thyari, delicate spiraling structures grown from living wood. On the other side was nothing, just gray dead stone, stripped of every molecule of life, stretching to the edge of sight, like a scar on the face of the planet. The Thyari came to meet them, emerging from a tunnel entrance carved into the base of a hill. They were smaller than Vasquez had expected, reaching only to her waist, with 6 limbs and wings that folded flat against their backs, and compound eyes that shimmered in the light of the twin suns. They moved carefully, hesitantly, like creatures that had forgotten what it felt like to walk under an open sky. Their leader was called Sethi Ka, an elder whose wings had gone pale with age, and whose voice carried the weight of a species that had spent 3 centuries preparing to die. She stood before Vasquez and looked up at the human, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. Then Sethi Ka made a gesture that the translator rendered as a combination of gratitude and disbelief, and something that had no human equivalent. A word that meant the feeling of waking up from a nightmare and discovering that you are still alive. "You came," Sethi Ka said. Vasquez nodded. "We came. We stopped believing anyone would. We stopped believing anyone could." The signal was automatic. It had been repeating for 100 years with no one listening. We thought we were already dead, just waiting for the body to notice. Vasquez knelt so that she was closer to the Thyari elder's eye level. "I need your help," she said. "We heard it, but we did not kill it. It is still out there, and it will come back unless we end this. I need everything you know, every record, every piece of data, information about what this thing is and where it comes from." Sethi Ka's wings trembled. "You do not understand what you are asking. You want to hunt the hunger. No one hunts the hunger. You survive it, or you do not." "Watch me," Vasquez said. The Thyari opened their archives, and the data that poured into the fleet's computers was staggering. 300 years of observations, intercepted signals, analysis from dozens of species that had tried and failed to stop the hunger. The picture it painted was vast and terrible. The hunger had been active in the galaxy for at least 1 million years. It moved in cycles, drifting through space in a dormant state, until it detected a living world, then descending and consuming everything before moving on. It had destroyed an estimated 400 civilizations, some of which had been spacefaring, some of which had been advanced beyond anything humanity had achieved. None of it mattered. Every species it encountered became food. The data also revealed something critical. The hunger was not a random swarm. It had a center, a core nexus, a massive biological structure hidden in a dark nebula 3 systems away from Vera. The core nexus was the brain of the entire organism, the place where it processed information, stored the genetic data of everything it had ever consumed, and coordinated the actions of every tendril and warship and parasite across light years of space. Destroy the core nexus and the entire hunger would collapse. Every tendril, every organism, every last parasite would lose coordination and die. No one had ever tried it, because no one had ever survived long enough to learn where it was. And no one who learned where it was had ever had the firepower to do anything about it. Vasquez had the firepower. She contacted Earth through a priority quantum link channel, and she laid out her plan to High Admiral Chen in terms that left no room for debate. The hunger was a galaxy-level threat, an extinction-class organism that would eventually reach human space if left unchecked. She had wounded it, and she knew where its heart was. She needed reinforcements to cut that heart out. Chen listened and then authorized the largest military deployment in human history. The Second Armada under Admiral Koss, the Third Armada under Admiral Petrov, and the Fifth Armada under Admiral Okafor. Over 500 additional warships, fully armed and crewed, began the FTL transit to Vera. While she waited, Vasquez repaired her damaged ships, tended to her wounded, and buried her dead. 41 sailors had been killed in the battle. the first humans ever to die fighting an alien enemy. She held a service for them, on the flight deck of the Unbroken, and she spoke each of their names, and she promised them that their deaths would mean something. Word of the battle spread. The Thyari relay networks carried the news across the galaxy, and it reached places that humanity had never known. Existed. Other species heard it. Civilizations that had been hiding from the hunger for centuries. Refugees and survivors and remnants of peoples who had lost their homeworlds to the swarm. They sent messages to the human fleet, tentative and disbelieving. Some asked if it was true. Some asked who the humans were. Some simply sent a single word, repeated over and over. A word that the translators rendered differently in every language, but that always meant the same thing. Hope. The reinforcements arrived 6 days later, and the sky above Vera 4 filled with human warships until the stars themselves seemed to move aside. Over 600 vessels, the combined might of a species that had spent its entire history preparing for a fight just like this one. Vasquez gathered her admirals on the Unbroken, and she laid out the plan on the holographic display. The Maw Nebula, 3 systems away, dense and dark, and hiding the core nexus of the hunger at its center. Go in, and they were going to destroy it. Admiral Koss, a tall man with a shaved head and calm eyes, studied the display and asked the question that was on everyone's mind. What kind of resistance should we expect? Vasquez looked at him. Everything it has left. It knows we are coming, and it will fight to protect its core. This will be the hardest battle any of us have ever fought. We will lose ships. We will lose people. She paused and looked at each of her admirals in turn. But we are going to win, she said, because that is what we do. The fleet assembled into attack formation, 600 warships arranged in a spearhead aimed at the heart of the oldest predator in the galaxy. Vasquez stood on the bridge of the Unbroken and gave the order. All units advance. Take us into the Maw. The fleet moved and the stars parted before it, and the darkness ahead waited with a hunger that was 1,000,000 years old. And for the first time in all those years, the darkness had reason to be afraid. The first wave of the hunger hit the fleet like a living wall. Thousands of smaller organisms, each one the size of a shuttle and shaped like a barbed seed, came screaming out of the dark at velocities that should have been impossible for biological things. They sprayed clouds of acid that could dissolve starship armor in minutes. Behind them came the electromagnetic disruption pulses, rolling waves of energy designed to fry circuits and blind sensors and leave ships drifting helpless in the void. And behind that came the microparasites, billions of them, each one smaller than a grain of sand, designed to slip through hull breaches and eat their way through crew members from the inside out. It was the same attack pattern that had destroyed every fleet before. It was elegant and terrible, and it had never failed. It failed now. The human warships did not flinch. The point defense networks opened up first. Thousands of automated turrets on every ship, each one tracking. Independently, each one firing hundreds of rounds per second. The microparasite clouds ran into walls of tungsten and fire, and were shredded into nothing. The acid-spitting organisms met the same fate, torn apart at range, before they could close. The electromagnetic pulses washed over the fleet and did absolutely nothing. Human electronic countermeasure suites had been designed to fight other humans, to counter the most sophisticated jamming technology ever created by a species that had been perfecting electronic warfare since the invention of radio. The hunger's disruption fields were primitive by comparison, like throwing rocks at a fortress. Vasquez watched the first exchange from her command chair on the bridge of the Unbroken, and she felt the cold anger in her chest turn into something sharper. Her ships had not even been scratched. All units, she said into the fleet channel. Doctrine 17, execute. Doctrine 17 was not designed for aliens. plan written 40 years ago for the suppression of fortified human colony rebellions. A three-phase strategy built on a simple principle that humanity had learned through 10,000 years of killing each other. Hit them so hard and so fast that they cannot think. Phase 1 was the long-range bombardment. The 6 dreadnoughts of the Iron Tide opened fire with their main batteries, magnetic accelerator cannons that hurled slugs of depleted uranium at a fraction of the speed of light. Each slug carried the kinetic energy of a small nuclear weapon, and the dreadnoughts fired them in coordinated volleys, dozens at a time, targeting the largest hunger organisms in orbit around Vera 4. The effect was immediate and devastating. The organic ships had never encountered kinetic weapons on this scale. Their dense biological armor, which had shrugged off energy weapons and acid and everything else the galaxy had thrown at them, meant nothing against a rod of metal moving at 60,000 kilometers per second. The slugs punched through them and out the other side, leaving holes the size of buildings, and the great living ships shuddered and split apart and died. Phase 2 was the carrier strike. 12 human carriers launched their fighter squadrons, over 1,000 small fast ships piloted by men and women who had trained for years in the most demanding combat program humanity had ever devised. They flew into the gaps blown open by the dreadnoughts, and they went to work with missiles and energy lances, isolating clusters of hunger organisms and cutting them apart piece by piece. The hunger tried to adapt. It always adapted. That was what it did, what it had done for 1,000,000 years. It shifted its tactics, pulled its forces together, tried to concentrate on individual human ships, and overwhelm them with numbers. But human fleet doctrine anticipated exactly this kind of response, because human enemies did exactly the same thing. The destroyers and frigates closed formation around the vulnerable carriers, creating overlapping fields of fire that turned every approach vector into a kill zone. Phase 3 was the spearhead. Vasquez herself led it, the Unbroken, at the tip of a wedge formation of heavy cruisers, driving straight into the heart of the Hunger's orbital presence. The cruisers fired everything they had, missiles and energy beams and kinetic rounds and nuclear-tipped torpedoes that detonated inside the bodies of the organic ships and blew them apart from within. The battle lasted 9 hours. 9 hours of continuous fire, of explosions that lit up the void like new stars, of human crews working damage control with burned hands and bleeding faces, and never once stopping. The Hunger threw everything it had at the fleet, and the fleet took it and kept coming and kept killing. In those 9 hours, the human fleet destroyed over 160 organic warships and thousands of smaller organisms. The Hunger had never lost a battle in its 1,000,000-year existence. It had consumed civilizations that were old when humanity was still living in caves. It had broken fleets 10 times the size of Vasquez's armada. And it was losing. Deep beneath the surface of Vera 4, in a bunker that shook with every orbital explosion, a Thyari communications officer sat at her ancient console and wept. She had activated the surface sensors for the first time in years, expecting to see another failed rescue burning in orbit. Instead, she saw something impossible. She saw the Hunger dying. She opened a broadcast channel to the remaining Thyari shelters, and her voice trembled as she spoke. She described the metal ships in orbit, the ones that burned like stars and roared like thunder. She described the weapons fire that split the sky. She described the Hunger's warships breaking and falling, trailing fire as they plunged into the atmosphere and crashed into the dead forests below. Creatures of metal, she said. They came from beyond the signal's reach. They are pushing the Hunger back. They are winning. Across the planet, in 100 bunkers and tunnels and hidden shelters, the Thyari listened, and for the first time in 300 years, they allowed themselves to hope. In orbit, the Hunger made a decision. No species had ever forced it to retreat, but no species had ever hurt it like this either. It began to pull back, withdrawing its remaining forces from the planet, gathering itself for a desperate flight to the safety of the deep void, where it could heal and grow and return. Vasquez saw it on the tactical display. The red dots were moving away, breaking orbit, running. "Admiral," Reeves said, "they are retreating. Do we let them go?" Vasquez did not hesitate, not for 1 second. She had seen the graveyard. She had read the Thyari communications. She knew what would happen if the hunger escaped. It would heal, and it would grow, and it would come back, and next time it would be even stronger. Know what humans were capable of, and it would be ready. "No," she said. "All units, full pursuit. Nothing gets away." The fleet surged forward, and the hunter-killer squadrons raced ahead like hounds, released from their chains. And they chased the hunger into the dark between the stars, and they killed everything they caught. When it was over, the space around Vera 4 was quiet for the first time in centuries. The wreckage of the hunger drifted alongside the wreckage of all the species that had come before. But this time the wreckage was different. This time the predator had become the prey. And then something happened that made every officer on the Unbroken's bridge go still. A signal came in from the fleeing remnants of the hunger, from somewhere deep in the void. Not an attack, not a feint. The fleet's AI analyzed it and confirmed it was a communication, a direct transmission aimed at the human fleet. It carried a single question, translated from a language that was not a language, from a mind that was not a mind, from a thing that had never needed to ask anything of anyone in 1,000,000 years of existence. "What are you?" The fleet dropped out of FTL into hell. That was the only word for it. The Vera system had 2 suns, one gold and one red, and their light fell across a field of wreckage so vast that the sensors could not find the edges of it. Thousands of ships, broken and drifting, scattered across millions of kilometers of empty space, like bones left on a battlefield after the scavengers had finished. Some were old, so old that their hulls had corroded into paper-thin shells of rust and dust. Some were new, still leaking atmosphere into the vacuum, their emergency lights still blinking red in the silence. They were not human ships. Every single one of them was alien, and no 2 designs were the same. There were sleek silver vessels that looked like they had been built by artists, and fat, bulky transports covered in strange symbols, and tiny needle-shaped craft barely larger than a human fighter, and enormous arcing structures that might have been warships or might have been cathedrals. All of them broken, all of them dead. Commander Talia Reeves, Vasquez's executive officer, stood at the sensor console and read the data as it came flooding in. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. "Over 4,000 confirmed wrecks," she said. "Multiple species, multiple design philosophies. The oldest wreckage dates back approximately 300 years. The newest is less than 12 hours old." Vasquez stood at the center of the bridge, with her arms behind her back and her jaw tight. She looked at the wreckage field on the main display, and she understood what she was seeing. This was not a battle. This was a graveyard. A monument to every civilization that had heard the same distress call and sent their best and watched their best die. "Someone has been killing rescue fleets for 3 centuries, Vasquez said. Reeves nodded. And no one stopped coming. Vasquez felt something cold settle into her chest. It was not fear. She had forgotten how to be afraid. Long time ago. It was anger, the deep, slow kind that burns like a reactor core, the kind that does not fade. She ordered the fleet to push forward toward the 4th planet in the system, the source of the original signal. Vira 4 was a green and blue world, smaller than Earth, with thick forests and wide oceans, and a thin band of cloud cover that caught the light of both suns and turned it into something beautiful. It should have been paradise. It was a slaughterhouse. The sensors painted the picture in terrible detail. Massive organic structures were descending from orbit, each one the size of a city, their surfaces dark and wet and pulsing like living tissue. They were landing on the planet and spreading across its surface like mold on fruit. And wherever they touched, the green turned to brown and the blue turned to black. They were eating the world, stripping it of every living thing, every tree and animal and microbe, pulling the biomass up into their bodies and leaving nothing but dead rock behind. The inhabitants of Vera 4 were called the Thyari. The fleet's AI compiled a profile from intercepted communications. They were insectoid, six-limbed, roughly the size of a large dog, with iridescent wings and compound eyes that could see in spectrums humans could not. They were brilliant, gifted in biology and medicine, and the subtle sciences of growing things. They had built their civilization not by conquering nature, but by working with it, shaping forests into cities, and rivers into networks, and living organisms into tools of breathtaking elegance. They had no army. They had no weapons. They had never needed them. Now, they were being consumed. The thing eating them had no name in any Thyari language. They simply called it the hunger, and the fleet's AI cross-referenced it against every database humanity had ever compiled, and found nothing. It was not a species in any recognizable sense. It was a swarm intelligence, a parasitic superorganism made up of billions of interconnected biological units that shared a single vast mind. It wandered the galaxy like a plague, arriving at living worlds, consuming everything, and moving on. It had been doing this for longer than most civilizations had existed. Period. The Thyari communications told the rest of the story. For 300 years, they had broadcast their distress call into space. And for 300 years, other species had answered. Dozens of civilizations had sent ships to help, science vessels and diplomatic envoys and small defense fleets, each one believing that they could reason with the hunger, or study it, or slow it down. None of them could. The wreckage field was their legacy, a ring of shattered hope orbiting a dying world. The Thyari had stopped believing anyone could save them. The distress signal was automated, a machine repeating a dead prayer into deaf space. No one was even monitoring it anymore. The surviving Thyari had retreated underground, into deep bunkers beneath the planet's crust, and they were waiting to die with the quiet dignity of a species that had accepted its extinction. Vasquez read all of this in silence. Then she turned to Reeves. "What is the combat capability of those organic ships in orbit?" Reeves checked the data. "Massive," she said. "Biological acid projectiles, electromagnetic disruption fields, and some kind of micro-parasite deployment system designed to breach hulls and consume crews from the inside. Every fleet that engaged them was destroyed within hours." "How many are there?" Reeves paused. "Sensor count shows approximately 200 large organisms in orbit, and thousands of smaller support units." Vasquez looked at the tactical display, where the red dots of the enemy swarmed around Vera 4 like flies on a wound. She thought about the Thyari in their bunkers, insectoid creatures with wings like rainbows who had never hurt anyone, waiting in the dark for the end. About the thousands of dead ships behind her, the courage of all those species who had come to help and failed. She thought about what it meant that humanity had built the most powerful war fleet in the galaxy and had never once had a good enough reason to use it. She thought about all of that for exactly 5 seconds. Then she spoke 2 words that changed the history of the galaxy. "Charge the main batteries." Every officer on the bridge looked at her. Reeves opened her mouth and then closed it. The weapons officer stared for a moment, and then a grin spread across his face, the kind of grin that wolves wear, and he turned to his console and began the firing sequence. Across the fleet, 140 warships came alive. Turrets rotated and locked. Missile bays opened like hungry mouths. Fighter squadrons loaded into launch tubes, shields powered up, and hummed with enough energy to light a city for a year. The Iron Tide had been sleeping, And now, it was awake. Awake. On the surface of Vera 4, deep in a bunker beneath a forest that no longer existed, a Thyari communications officer noticed something on her ancient monitoring equipment. A new signal, not from the hunger, coming from the outer edge of the system. She almost ignored it, because signals from the outer edge always meant the same thing: another doomed rescue fleet about to die. But this signal was different. It was not a hail, or a diplomatic greeting, or a scientific inquiry. It was a targeting lock, and there were 140 of them. The hunger turned its attention toward the edge of the system, toward the largest concentration of biomass it had encountered in 300 years, and it began to move. It did not know what was coming. The signal came on a Tuesday, which was strange because nobody expected the universe to change on a Tuesday. It started as noise, just a faint hum buried in the static that the Deep Space Listening Array on the dark side of Luna picked up between routine scans of dead space. A young technician named Orrin Watts almost deleted it. He had been working a double shift, and his eyes were burning and his coffee was cold, and the hum looked like nothing more than background radiation bouncing off a dust cloud. But something made him stop. Something made him listen again. He ran it through the filters a second time, and then a third time, and by the fourth pass his hands were shaking because the pattern was too clean, too structured, too deliberate to be natural. He called his supervisor, and his supervisor called the chief analyst, and the chief analyst called the director of the Terran Signal Intelligence Division. And within 6 hours, every linguist, cryptographer, and artificial intelligence unit on Luna was staring at the same data. It was a message, not human, the first confirmed alien transmission in the history of the species. It took 72 hours to crack it, and when the translation came through, the room went silent. The message was fragmented and broken, repeating on a loop like a recording that had been playing for a very long time. The words were simple and terrible. They are consuming us. Please, anyone. The signal carried coordinates pointing to a system called Vera, 190 light-years from Earth. It also carried biological data, atmospheric readings, and what appeared to be a population count that was dropping in real time. Someone out there was dying, and they had thrown their voice into the void hoping that someone, anyone, would hear. Earth heard. The civilian government reacted the way civilian governments always react. They formed committees and scheduled debates, and argued about jurisdiction and protocol and the philosophical implications of first contact. Senators gave speeches about caution. Diplomats urged patience. Scientists demanded more data before any action could be taken. The United Terran Navy did not debate. Fleet Admiral Rena Vasquez received the intelligence briefing at her headquarters on Titan, and she read it once, then read it again, then closed the file and stood at her window, looking out at the orange haze of Saturn's largest moon. She was 57 years old, with silver hair cut short, and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone by someone who did not believe in softness. She had commanded warships for 30 years, and had fought in the colonial insurrections, the pirate purges of the Outer Belt, and the brutal border skirmish at Kepler 442 that had cost her her left hand, which was now replaced with a prosthetic that could crush titanium. She had spent the last 5 years waiting for something to happen. The fleet was restless, trained to a razor edge with nothing to cut. Her soldiers drilled and sparred and simulated battles against enemies that did not exist. And every year, the politicians talked about reducing the military budget. Because what did humanity need with 600 warships when there was no one to fight? Now, there was someone to fight. Vasquez contacted High Admiral Chen at Terran Command, and the conversation lasted 4 minutes. She requested authorization to mobilize the first expeditionary armada. He gave it without hesitation. She assembled her fleet in the shadow of Titan, and it was a sight that would have made ancient gods weep with envy. 140 warships, painted black and bristling with weapons that had been designed by a species that had spent its entire existence finding better ways to kill. The Iron Tide, they called it. 6 Planet Cracker-class dreadnoughts formed the core, each one 3 kilometers long, and carrying enough firepower to reduce a continent to glass. Around them clustered heavy cruisers, destroyers, frigates, carrier ships loaded with fighter squadrons, and fast attack corvettes that could outrun light itself. The crews were not scientists or diplomats. They were soldiers, every one of them, veterans of ugly fights in dark places, men and women who had signed up not because they loved war, but because they understood that the universe did not care about peace unless someone was willing to bleed for it. They were rough and scarred and tired of waiting. Vasquez stood on the bridge of her flagship, the TNS Unbroken, and opened a channel to every ship in the formation. Her voice was calm and steady, the way it always was, the way it had been when she ordered the assault on the pirate fortress at Ceres, the way it had been when she held the line at Kepler, with half her fleet burning around her. "We have received a signal from beyond our borders," she said. "A species we have never met is asking for. We do not know what they look like, or how they think, or whether they will thank us or fear us. We do not know what is killing them. We do not know if we can stop it. But someone out there sent a message into the dark, and we are what the dark sent back. We are what humanity sends when help is needed." The fleet moved into formation, and the FTL drives began to spin up, bending space around each vessel like a fist closing around a marble. One by one, the ships vanished from normal space, punching through the fabric of reality and hurtling toward a star system that no human had ever visited, to fight an enemy that no human had ever seen. Vasquez sat in her command chair and watched the transit display as the light years burned away. She thought about the signal and the voice behind it, some alien creature sitting in the ruins of its world, broadcasting a plea that it probably believed no one would ever answer. She wondered what it must be like to be that alone, to cry out into the dark, emptiness, and hear nothing back. She would make sure that silence ended. 12 hours into the transit, the communications officer looked up from her console with a face that had gone pale. "Admiral," she said, "the signal has stopped." Vasquez did not move. She stared at the display for a long time, and then she spoke. "Increase speed to maximum." The fleet screamed through folded space, and the stars blurred into white lines, and 140 warships, built by the deadliest species in the galaxy, raced toward a silence that meant either the dying had stopped calling or the dying was already done.